With nothing but his late father's shotgun and a deep-rooted commitment to protect his land from trespassers, Thomas Blackwell confronts a pack of aggressive bikers who have been terrorizing local farmers for months. What he doesn't realize is that beneath the menacing leather jackets and thundering motorcycles lies a criminal network worth millions and evidence of a decades-old betrayal that would shake the foundations of Riverdale County's judicial system. As former military intelligence officer Sarah Donovan helps piece together the connection between the bikers and a local corruption scheme, Thomas finds himself caught between defending his homestead and exposing a criminal enterprise that shaped the region's underbelly, but might cost him the very farm he's fighting to preserve. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fourth straight month of harassment had turned Blackwell Farm into a landscape that resembled a battlefield more than the peaceful countryside it had once been. The rutted tracks, torn through the eastern cornfield by motorcycles, stood as stark evidence of the bikers' continued trespassing, their destruction, a testament to the severity of the intimidation campaign plaguing Riverdale County. Thomas Blackwell stood at the edge of what should have been his best corn crop, work boots sinking into soil that had once yielded bountiful harvests, but now displayed the scars of deliberate damage. At 47, he had weathered challenging times. Before, droughts, market crashes, equipment failures, but nothing like this systematic campaign of destruction and fear. His weathered face had settled into permanent lines of determination. His powerful shoulders, built through decades of physical labor, now squared with the resolve of a man pushed to his limits. "It's getting worse, Rex," he said to the German, Shepherd at his heels. The dog growled softly, ears perked toward the distant sound of motorcycles that had become an ominous soundtrack to their lives over recent months. They walked toward the damaged fence line that marked the eastern boundary of the property, the third repair he'd made in as many weeks. The Blackwell family had survived the Great Depression, weathered the farming crisis of the 1980s, and adapted to changing agricultural markets for generations. But this targeted campaign, combined with 2 consecutive years of falling crop prices and rising equipment costs, had pushed Blackwell Farm to a breaking point unlike any it had faced before. Thomas lifted a section of barbed wire that had been cut clean through, the metal edges still sharp. This wasn't accidental damage from wildlife or weather. This was deliberate sabotage. "Professional work," he muttered, examining the clean cuts as Rex sniffed around the perimeter, alert to any lingering sense of the intruders. The sound of tires on the gravel driveway announced a visitor. Thomas turned to see a cloud of dust trailing behind a white county sheriff's SUV. Deputy Lisa Hernandez had been with the Riverdale County Sheriff's Department for nearly 8 years. She knew every farmer in the region by name and could navigate the back roads blindfolded. Today, her normally friendly expression was replaced with professional concern. "I wish this was just a social call," she said as she approached, notepad already in hand. "Another report to file?" Thomas asked, though. He already knew the answer. She nodded grimly. "That's 5 incidents on your property this month alone, Thomas. The sheriff's office is stretched thin, but I promise we're doing everything we can." Thomas handed her the cut section of wire. "This isn't random, Lisa. Someone wants me gone." Deputy Hernandez examined the clean cut, her brow furrowing. "You're not the only one. The Millers over on County Road 8 had their irrigation system sabotaged last week. The Johnsons found their cattle gates opened the week before that. All the affected farms form a pattern along the eastern corridor, where that developer wants to build the new resort complex," Thomas finished, connecting the dots that had been forming in his mind for weeks. Hernandez's expression confirmed his suspicion. Randall Developments has been buying up properties wherever they can. Those who won't sell have been experiencing difficulties. You mean harassment, Thomas corrected bluntly. Why isn't the sheriff doing more? These are criminal acts. Deputy Hernandez lowered her voice slightly. Between us, Sheriff Wilcox seems reluctant to put serious resources into these investigations. Claims it's probably just local troublemakers, not connected to Randall. Her expression suggested she thought otherwise. The county commissioners are all backing that resort project. Tax revenue, jobs, tourism dollars. Politics is getting in the way of policing. Thomas's jaw tightened. James Randall, CEO of Randall Developments and the county's wealthiest resident, had made increasingly aggressive offers to buy Blackwell Farm over the past year. His latest offer was twice the property's market value, a premium that made Thomas suspicious of the man's motives, especially given the farm's strategic location overlooking the river that would be central to Randall's planned resort. "I'm not selling to Randall," he said flatly, "not while I still have breath in my body." Hernandez's expression softened slightly. "Thomas, I understand the farm's been in your family for generations, but at some point you have to consider your safety. These bikers, the Red Chain Gang, they're not just weekend warriors. They have connections to organized crime in the city. If Randall has hired them as intimidation, then he's crossed from being a pushy businessman to a criminal," Thomas interrupted, "and someone needs to stand up to him." She sighed, clearly having heard similar determined statements from other farmers facing intimidation. "Just be careful, and call immediately if they return. Don't try to confront them yourself." She glanced at the weathered farmhouse where Thomas had been born and raised. "And think about installing security cameras. The department can't spare patrols out here as often as I'd like." After Deputy Hernandez left, Thomas stood motionless beside the damaged fence. Her report form crumpled slightly in his fist as Rex pressed against his leg, offering silent support. The dog's ears suddenly perked up, his attention drawn to the eastern tree line. Thomas followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual among the dense oak and maple that bordered that section of the property. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That evening, after reviewing his dwindling financial options and finding no path to hiring private security through conventional means, Thomas climbed to the attic of the farmhouse. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as he made his way to an old military footlocker tucked beneath the eaves. The chest had belonged to his father, Colonel William Blackwell, who had served in military intelligence before returning to take over the family farm when Thomas's grandfather fell ill. Family legend held that Colonel Blackwell had continued some classified work even after returning to civilian life, occasionally disappearing for days on classified assignments during Thomas's childhood. The colonel had been a mystery in many ways, a decorated soldier who chose to return to farming, a man who spoke 5 languages but preferred the company of his livestock to most people, a father who taught Thomas both how to nurture growing things and how to defend what he loved. Thomas hadn't examined his father's military effects since inheriting the farm 15 years ago after the colonel's sudden heart attack, viewing them more as private mementos than practical resources. The footlocker's heavy padlock gave way to the key Thomas kept on his own keyring, revealing neatly stacked notebooks, maps, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment from an earlier era. The notebooks contained his father's meticulous observations, written in a personal shorthand that Thomas had learned as a teenager when the colonel insisted he master the skill just in case. Most entries detailed farm operations and local matters, but interspersed were cryptic references to operations and individuals that clearly had nothing to do with agriculture. May 15th, 1985. Surveillance on Target Echo continues. Subject has made contact with 3 known associates from the orbital file. Local enforcement compromised at highest levels, maintaining independent observation. Thomas flipped forward, looking for any indication of what his father might have been involved in locally. June 28, 1985. Subject JR displays concerning pattern. Initial assessment suggested opportunistic corruption, but evidence now indicates systematic network extending to state level. Asset Nighthawk confirms judicial appointments being influenced through financial channels previously identified in Operation Westwind. The initials caught Thomas's attention. JR. Could that be James Randall? The man would have been starting his real estate career in the mid-1980s. Thomas continued reading. July 3, 1985. Meeting with handler confirmed. Operation Clearwater authorized to continue under agricultural cover. Farm provides ideal observation. Point for Riverside activities. Nighthawk reports increased traffic at location Indigo, consistent with distribution pattern. The mention of the Riverside location sent a chill through Thomas. His farm overlooked precisely the section of riverfront that was central to Randall's proposed resort development. Had his father been using the property as some sort of surveillance position for an intelligence operation? The idea seemed far-fetched, yet the colonel's notes were detailed and specific. July 12, 1985. JR visited today, ostensibly to discuss purchasing river parcels, offered twice market value. When declined, manner became inappropriately insistent, suggests personal rather than business interest in acquiring specifically this property. Security measures increased. Nighthawk warned that JR has connection to subject group Red Chain through intermediary, not yet identified. Thomas sat back against a roof beam, his mind racing. Red Chain, the same name as the biker gang currently terrorizing local farmers, including himself. And James Randall had been trying to acquire the farm even back then, during his father's time. Could there be a connection between those past events and the current harassment campaign? Further entries documented increasing pressure tactics. August 17, 1985. Systematic pattern of interference continues. Farm equipment sabotaged. Livestock fences cut. Local sheriff dismissive of reports, consistent with intelligence about compromised law enforcement, will implement countermeasures as authorized in Clearwater protocols. September 2, 1985. Surveillance. Equipment installed at River Bend location. First 24 hours captured significant activity consistent with handlers' intelligence about narcotics movement. JR is proposed marina development. Appears to be cover for distribution hub. Documentation secured in secondary location as per protocol. The last entry in the journal was dated just 3 days before his father's reported heart attack. October 10, 1998. Evidence compilation complete. Meeting with Federal Task Force. Tomorrow to turn over all Clearwater documentation. After 13 years, sufficient proof accumulated to move against primary targets, including JR and compromised officials. Nighthawk has been extracted for protection. This will be final entry before operation transitions to federal jurisdiction. Thomas stared at the date, a cold realization washing over him. His father had died before that meeting could take place. What had been ruled a natural death, a heart attack in a man with a family history of cardiac problems, now took on a more sinister possibility. Beneath the notebooks lay a sealed waterproof pouch labeled Contingency Secure Location. Inside, Thomas found a hand-drawn map of the farm with an X marked in the northeastern corner, along with a small key taped to the paper. Scrawled in his father's distinctive handwriting was a simple message. For Thomas, if needed, destroy after retrieval. The northeastern corner housed an old storm shelter, a concrete bunker built during the Cold War era that Thomas used, and primarily for storage now. The implication was clear. His father had hidden something there, something connected to whatever operation he'd been running from the farm, something potentially dangerous enough that he'd created a contingency plan. For Thomas to find it if necessary, a new sense of purpose replaced Thomas's earlier despair. If his father had been investigating corruption involving James Randall and the same biker gang that was currently terrorizing the county, then what was happening now wasn't just about a resort development. The harassment, the pressure to sell, Randall's fixation on this specific property, it was about something bigger. The next morning, Thomas rose before dawn, Rex at his heels as they made their way to the old storm shelter. The structure was partially buried in a hillside, its concrete entrance almost hidden by years of encroaching vegetation, which had suited Thomas fine as it kept the unsightly bunker largely out of view. Now, he wondered if his father had encouraged that concealment for security reasons rather than aesthetics. The shelter's heavy door groaned as Thomas pulled it open, revealing stone steps leading down into musty darkness. He switched on his flashlight, Rex pressing close against his legs as they descended. The main chamber was filled with the expected assortment of farm equipment parts, preserved food from seasons past, and emergency supplies. But Thomas headed directly to the back wall, where a large metal cabinet stood bolted to the concrete. He'd always assumed it contained additional emergency supplies or perhaps old farm records. The small key from his father's contingency package fit perfectly into the cabinet's lock. Inside, Thomas found not papers or supplies, but sophisticated surveillance equipment, much more advanced than what he'd seen in the footlocker, and several waterproof cases secured with combination locks. The first case opened to the combination Thomas had used since childhood, his birthday. His father had always insisted he memorize certain number sequences because you never know when you'll need a good combination. Inside lay hundreds of photographs, meticulously labeled and dated, showing what appeared to be nighttime river activities. Boats exchanging packages, individuals Thomas didn't recognize, and most surprisingly, uniformed officers assisting with the unloading of unmarked crates. The second case contained dozens of microcassette tapes, each labeled with dates and initials, along with a player that still had working batteries. His father's thoroughness extending even to that detail. Thomas selected one labeled JRSW Meeting 06-17-1997 and pressed play. The voices that emerged from the small speaker were slightly tinny, but clear enough to recognize. One belonged unmistakably to James Randall. The other Thomas eventually placed as belonging to a younger version of current Sheriff Scott Wilcox. "The federal task force is sniffing around again," Randall's voice said. "Someone's feeding them information about the river operations." "We've got people in the county office," Sheriff Wilcox replied. "Nothing comes across their desks that we don't know about." "That means they have a source outside official channels," Randall snapped. "Someone's watching and reporting. I want to know who." "Could be any of these farms along the eastern corridor," Wilcox said. "They all have good vantage points." "Then we need to control that corridor," Randall said. "Offer to buy them out. Those who won't sell, make them sell." "Some of these families have been here for generations," Wilcox cautioned. "They won't be easily moved." "Everyone has a breaking point," Randall replied coldly. "Find theirs. Use the red chain if necessary. They've been useful before. Keep your deputies looking the other way." The recording continued, detailing plans for what was clearly a narcotics distribution operation using the river as a transportation route, with local law enforcement providing protection. The resort development Randall now proposed publicly had been in planning for decades, not as a legitimate business, but as a permanent base for expanded criminal operations that would launder money through seemingly legitimate hospitality businesses. Thomas listened to several more recordings, each more damning than the last. His father had spent years gathering evidence of corruption that reached from local law enforcement to state-level officials, all centered around James Randall's criminal enterprise. And the last recording, dated just a week before his father's death, suggested the colonel had finally accumulated enough evidence to bring the entire operation down. A week before, he supposedly died of natural causes. The third case contained what appeared to be the complete evidence portfolio his father had mentioned, assembling for federal authorities: financial records showing money laundering, surveillance photos documenting drug shipments, recordings of incriminating conversations, and a detailed organizational chart connecting James Randall to both corrupt officials and the Red Chain Gang. Most damningly, it included medical reports suggesting that certain individuals who had opposed Randall over the years, people officially ruled to have died from accidents or natural causes, may have been murdered, including Thomas, suspected with growing certainty, Colonel William Blackwell himself. The implications were staggering. The harassment Thomas faced wasn't simply about acquiring his farm for a resort development. It was about eliminating the property that had once been used to gather evidence against a criminal enterprise. A property whose strategic vantage point made it uniquely dangerous to Randall's operations, especially if someone were to pick up where the colonel had left off. Thomas needed to get this evidence to trustworthy authorities, but his father's notes made clear that local law enforcement couldn't be trusted. He needed someone with investigative expertise, someone outside the local power structure, someone who could help him understand the full scope of what his father had uncovered and how to proceed safely. His search led him to Sarah Donovan, a former military intelligence officer who had served under his father in the 1990s before becoming a private investigator specializing in corruption cases. Her published articles frequently criticized inadequate oversight of rural criminal enterprises and the vulnerability of agricultural communities to organized crime, precisely the issues at the heart of Thomas's situation. Thomas composed a careful email referencing his father by his military designation rather than name and requesting a confidential consultation without revealing specific details that might be intercepted. To his surprise, Sarah responded within hours. "Colonel Blackwell's son, your father was one of the finest officers I ever served with. His last operation was never properly concluded due to his unexpected death, which some of us had questions about that were never addressed. I'm in your state on another case this week. I can make time for a meeting tomorrow if that suits. Please suggest a location not in Riverdale County, for both our safety." When Sarah arrived at the diner 2 counties over that Thomas had suggested for their meeting, he was struck by how different she was from his mental image. He'd expected someone older, perhaps more bureaucratic in appearance. Instead, Sarah Donovan was in her early 40s, dressed practically in jeans, boots, and a weathered leather jacket, her dark hair cut in a no-nonsense style that framed intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Blackwell," she greeted him, extending a hand that was strong and confident. "Thank you for reaching out. I've thought about your father's unfinished business for many years." "Just Thomas, please," he replied, shaking her hand. "And I appreciate your discretion. I've recently discovered that my father's unfinished business might be directly connected to problems I'm facing now." Sarah's expression sharpened with immediate interest. "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, Thomas detailed the escalating harassment, the pressure to sell his farm, and most importantly, his discovery of his father's hidden evidence cache. Sarah listened intently, occasionally making notes, but mostly absorbing the information with the focused attention of someone assembling puzzle pieces into a coherent picture. "Your father contacted me a week before his death," she revealed after Thomas finished. "He said he had accumulated enough evidence to bring down what he called a cancer in the heartland, a criminal network using agricultural communities as cover for drug distribution. with corruption reaching into local government and law enforcement. He was scheduled to meet with a federal task force, but he died before that meeting could take place. Her expression darkened. Many of us felt the timing was suspicious, but there was no evidence of foul play that could overcome the medical examiner's determination of natural causes. "You think he was murdered," Thomas said. "It wasn't a question. I think your father was one of the most careful, thorough intelligence operators I ever knew," Sarah replied carefully. "And I think powerful people had strong motives to silence him, but proving that 22 years later would be extremely difficult." She leaned forward. "What's more relevant now is that the same criminal enterprise appears to be active and targeting you." "What's my next step?" Thomas asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "We need to move quickly," Sarah said. "If Randall suspects you've found your father's evidence, you're in serious danger." She thought for a moment. "The evidence can't go to local authorities, obviously. We need to bring in federal investigators, but we need to do it carefully to avoid tipping off Randall or his law enforcement allies." "I've created digital copies of everything," Thomas said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "But the originals are still hidden on the farm." Sarah pocketed the drive. "Good first step, but we need to secure those originals as well. They contain physical evidence that can't be replicated digitally." She checked her watch. "I have contacts in the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. I can reach out through secure channels, but it will take at least 48 hours to arrange a proper response. In the meantime, you need to return to your farm and act normal. Give no indication that anything has changed." "And if the red chain returns before then?" Thomas asked. Sarah's expression was grim. "Document everything, but don't directly engage. Your father's evidence is worth far more than any property damage they might cause." She hesitated, then added, "But protect yourself if threatened physically. Just be aware that if Randall has the sheriff in his pocket, any incident will be twisted against you." As they parted, Sarah emphasized the importance of normal routines and communication security. "Use only the encrypted messaging app I've installed on your phone. No calls, no emails, no discussions with anyone local, no matter how trustworthy they might seem." Operation Clearwater had a serious leak somewhere. That's why your father operated alone in the later years. We don't know if that leak was ever identified. Thomas returned to Blackwell Farm with a strange mixture of dread and determination. His father's shadow seemed to walk beside him now, the colonel's meticulous planning, years of solitary vigilance, and ultimate sacrifice taking on new meaning. What Thomas had sometimes perceived as paranoia or overprotectiveness in his father now revealed itself as the necessary caution of a man fighting corruption from within the heart of a community it had infected. As dusk settled over the farm, Thomas took Rex on their usual perimeter check, deliberately maintaining the routines that would appear normal to anyone watching. The evening was unusually quiet. No distant motorcycle engines, no signs of trespassing or sabotage. The stillness should have been reassuring, but instead it raised the hairs on the back of Thomas's neck. After months of escalating harassment, the sudden absence felt not like relief, but like the calm before a storm. He was right. Shortly after midnight, Rex's growling woke Thomas from a light sleep. The dog stood rigid by the bedroom window, hackles raised, emitting the low, threatening rumble he reserved for human intruders rather than wildlife. Thomas slipped from bed and moved silently to the window, staying to the side to avoid being silhouetted against the glass. In the moonlight, he could see them. At least 8 motorcycles approaching slowly up the long driveway, their engines uncharacteristically muted. This wasn't the usual harassment run with revving engines and deliberate noise meant to intimidate. This was something more purposeful. Thomas reached for his phone and sent a quick message through the encrypted app Sarah had installed. "Visitors, 8+, middle of night." not the usual approach. Her response came seconds later. Hide the originals. Different location from before. Document only. Federal contact arriving tomorrow afternoon. But as Thomas watched the methodical approach of the bikers, something told him this wasn't just another intimidation tactic. The red chain had never come in force like this. Never in the middle of the night with muffled engines. Never with what appeared to be organized formation. This wasn't harassment, it was an operation. They were coming to search the farm, coming for his father's evidence. Thomas had to act quickly. With the red chain gang approaching his farmhouse, he knew he had only minutes to secure his father's evidence before they reached the house. He grabbed his shotgun from the rack, not for confrontation, but for last resort protection, and moved swiftly to the storm shelter where the original evidence remained. "Stay alert, Rex," he whispered to the German shepherd, who followed closely, hackles still raised. "Guard!" The dog took up position at the shelter entrance, trained by Thomas to watch for intruders, while he quickly gathered the waterproof cases containing his father's meticulous documentation. The recordings, photographs, and handwritten notes represented not just evidence of criminality, but his father's legacy. A silent, years-long battle against corruption that had ultimately cost Colonel Blackwell his life. Thomas needed a new hiding place, somewhere no one would think to look. His father's voice seemed to echo in his mind. "The best hiding place is often in plain sight, son. People overlook what they don't expect to find." Inspiration struck as his flashlight beam caught the ancient John Deere tractor his grandfather had purchased in 1952. The tractor had been lovingly maintained, but was now used mainly for small jobs and nostalgic farm tours. Most importantly, its hollow frame and modified fuel tank had once been used by Thomas's grandfather to smuggle refugees across state lines during a darker period of American history, a family secret passed down with pride. Thomas quickly secured the evidence cases inside the tractor's hidden compartments, carefully reassembling the access panels. Even if the bikers tore apart the farm looking for evidence, they were unlikely to dismantle a vintage tractor or recognize its modifications. It wouldn't withstand a professional forensic search, but it might be enough to buy the time Sarah needed to bring in federal authorities. As he finished concealing the last case, the rumble of motorcycles grew louder. They were approaching the farmhouse. Thomas hurried back with Rex, entering through the rear door and positioning himself in the darkened living room where he could observe the front yard without being easily seen. The bikers circled the house once before cutting their engines. In the moonlight, Thomas counted 12 men, more than he'd initially estimated. They wore the distinctive leather jackets emblazoned with the Red Chain Gang's insignia. But their movements betrayed something beyond common thuggery. They moved with coordinated precision, taking up positions with tactical efficiency that spoke of military or law enforcement training. Their leader, a tall man with a graying beard, gestured silently, and 4 of the bikers disappeared around the back of the house. 2 others headed toward the barn, while the remaining 6 approached the front door. Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead as he calculated his options. Direct confrontation against these numbers was suicide, especially if they were armed, which he had to assume they were. The pounding on his front door was expectedly aggressive. "Blackwell, open up! We need to talk!" The voice was gravelly, commanding, a voice accustomed to being obeyed. Thomas made a split-second decision. Rather than hiding or trying to slip away, he would face them, but on his terms. He positioned his shotgun near the door but not in hand, turned on the porch light to better identify the intruders, and opened the door while keeping the security chain engaged. "It's midnight on private property," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Whatever you want can wait until morning." The leader of the bikers, a man Thomas now recognized as Victor Crane, rumored to be the Red Chain's president, smiled without warmth. Afraid that won't work, Blackwell. We've got business that's time-sensitive. Any legitimate business can go through my lawyer during business hours, Thomas replied. Otherwise, you're trespassing, and I'm within my rights to defend my property. Crane's smile disappeared. We know you found your daddy's little treasure. Chest, Blackwell, those files don't belong to you. They were stolen property 20 years ago, and they're stolen property now. The directness of the accusation confirmed Thomas's suspicions. Someone had connected him to his father's evidence. Either they'd been watching the farm more closely than he realized, or they had a source of information he hadn't considered. I don't know what you're talking about, Thomas said, maintaining eye contact with Crane. My father was a farmer who died of a heart attack. If you're looking for treasure, you've got the wrong place. Crane sighed dramatically. We can do this easy or hard, Blackwell. Easy way. You hand over everything you found in that bunker, we ride out, and you get to keep farming until Randall's bulldozers come through. Hard way. He gestured to the men flanking him, several of whom had moved their hands to their jackets, implying concealed weapons. Well, farming accidents happen all the time, don't they? Thomas noticed movement beyond the bikers, headlights approaching. Down the long driveway, someone else was coming, complicating an already dangerous situation. Looks like we have company, he observed, hoping to buy time. Crane didn't turn. That'll be the sheriff. Like I said, time-sensitive business. The arrival of Sheriff Wilcox should have been reassuring, but given what Thomas now knew about the man's corruption, it only confirmed the gravity of the situation. This wasn't random harassment anymore. This was a coordinated operation between the Red Chain Gang and corrupt law enforcement to recover the evidence that could destroy them all. The sheriff's cruiser pulled up behind the motorcycles, and Scott Wilcox emerged, looking grim in his official uniform. He approached with the practiced confidence of authority, nodding to Crane before addressing Thomas. Mr. Blackwell, I need you to cooperate with these gentlemen. We have reason to believe you're in possession of stolen property, specifically surveillance equipment and recordings taken illegally by your father years ago. The official veneer was thin, but it was enough to give this midnight raid a paper-thin cover of legitimacy, at least until morning when Thomas might be able to contact a lawyer or Sarah Donovan. Sheriff, these men have been harassing me for months, Thomas said loudly, making sure his voice would carry to any cruiser dash cameras or body cameras that might be recording. Now they show up at midnight with vague accusations about my deceased father. If there's a legitimate legal concern, serve a warrant during normal hours. Otherwise, this looks an awful lot like intimidation. Wilcox's expression hardened. I do have a warrant, Mr. Blackwell. He produced an official-looking document, signed by Judge Harrison this evening after we received information about possible evidence tampering and concealment of materials relevant to an ongoing investigation. Thomas's heart sank. Judge Harrison was another name that had appeared in his father's notes, another official in Randall's pocket. The warrant might even be technically legal if fraudulently obtained, which meant resistance could give them cause to arrest him. I want to call my lawyer, Thomas stated firmly. You can call anyone you want, Wilcox replied, after we've executed this search warrant. Now step aside, or I'll have to consider that obstruction. Thomas knew he was outmaneuvered. Direct resistance would only lead to his arrest, or worse, leaving the farm unsecured for a more thorough search. His only hope was that his father's evidence was well hidden enough to survive their initial sweep, giving Sarah time to bring in federal authorities who weren't compromised. He reluctantly unlatched the chain and stepped back. I'm cooperating. Under protest, Sheriff. I want that noted. Duly noted, Wilcox said without interest, as he and the bikers pushed past into the farmhouse. What followed was a systematic ransacking of Thomas's home. The bikers, clearly familiar with search techniques, methodically went through every room while Sheriff Wilcox supervised with the detached air of someone watching a well-rehearsed play. They pulled out drawers, upended furniture, pulled books from shelves, and checked for hidden compartments or safe spaces where documents might be concealed. Thomas stood in the kitchen, Rex at his side, watching the destruction of his home with a controlled fury. The dog growled continuously, but remained by his master's side as instructed, though his bared teeth suggested he was only marginally under control. "Call off your dog, Blackwell," Crane warned as he entered the kitchen. "He starts anything, my boys will finish it." "He stays with me," Thomas replied evenly. "As long as no one makes any threatening moves toward me, he won't attack." After nearly an hour of searching the house without success, the focus shifted outward. The shed, the barn, the equipment storage, all were thoroughly examined. Thomas felt a moment of panic when they approached the old storm shelter, but Crane emerged shortly after, frustration evident on his face. "Nothing in the bunker either," he reported to Wilcox. "If it was there, he's moved it." Thomas maintained his composure, though inwardly he felt a surge of gratitude for his decision to relocate the evidence. His father's voice seemed to whisper approval in his ear. Wilcox approached Thomas, suspicion evident in his narrowed eyes. "Where did you hide it, Blackwell?" "Hide what, Sheriff? I still don't know what you're looking for." Thomas maintained his ignorant stance. "But I do know I'll be filing a formal complaint about this raid and the ongoing harassment I've experienced." The sheriff leaned closer, dropping his official pretense. "Your father should have minded his own business 20 years ago, and you should mind yours now. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, just like he is." The thinly veiled confession of his father's murder sparked a rage in Thomas that he struggled to contain. Only the knowledge that an emotional reaction would play into their hands kept him from lunging at Wilcox. "Are you threatening me, Sheriff?" he asked, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. Wilcox stepped back, resuming his professional demeanor. "Just giving friendly advice, Mr. Blackwell. Farmers who stick to farming tend to live longer, healthier lives." He turned to Crane. "We're done here for now. Mr. Blackwell, don't leave the county. We may have additional questions." As the intruders finally departed, their motorcycles roaring back to life with all pretense of stealth abandoned, Thomas surveyed the devastation of his home. The physical damage was extensive, but repairable. More concerning was the confirmation that Randall's criminal network remained active and powerful, and now knew that Thomas had discovered his father's evidence. He waited until the last taillights disappeared down his long driveway before retrieving his phone and sending a secure message to Sarah. "Raid just concluded. Sheriff plus red chain. Had warrant. Searched everything. Evidence secure in new location. They know I found something." Her reply came moments later. "Stay on farm, armed if possible. I'm expediting federal response. ETA now, 0900 tomorrow. Document all damage for evidence." Thomas spent the next hour photographing the destruction throughout his property, creating a meticulous record, just as his father would have done. As he worked, his initial fear gradually transformed into a steely resolve. The colonel had fought this battle alone for years, gathering evidence piece by piece while maintaining his cover as a simple farmer. Now it fell to Thomas to complete his father's mission, to expose the corruption that had festered in Riverdale County for decades, and bring justice not just for Colonel Blackwell, but for every farmer who had been pressured, harassed, or worse. Near dawn, as Thomas finished securing the farmhouse as best he could, his encrypted phone chimed with another message from Sarah. "New development. Identified potential insider who may have alerted them to your discovery. Deputy Lisa Hernandez. Has unusual financial patterns. Recent large deposits coincide with your finding the evidence. Be cautious." The revelation struck Thomas hard. Deputy Hernandez had seemed genuinely concerned about the harassment he'd faced. She'd been sympathetic, professional, and apparently helpful. If she was indeed part of Randall's network, it suggested the corruption was even more pervasive than he'd realized, and that his father's operation had been compromised by someone who could monitor police responses to his complaints, tracking patterns, and possibly even surveillance on his movements. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern fields, illuminating the damage done to his crops by the bikers' previous raids, Thomas made a decision. He wouldn't be driven from his land as others had been. He wouldn't be silenced as his father had been. The farm represented not just his livelihood, but 4 generations of Blackwell determination and integrity. His father had used this vantage point to document criminal activity for years. Now Thomas would use it as the foundation for bringing the entire network down. He spent the early morning securing the property as best he could, positioning trail cameras at strategic points along the perimeter, not the obvious entry points that would be easily spotted, but secondary approaches that might capture useful evidence. He then performed his normal morning farm routines, feeding livestock and checking irrigation systems, presenting the image of a farmer simply going about his business despite the disruption of the night before. At precisely 9 a.m., an unmarked SUV with government plates turned up his driveway. Sarah Donovan emerged from the passenger side, accompanied by a tall, austere-looking man in a nondescript suit who surveyed the property with the experienced eye of someone assessing both threats and evidence. "Thomas," Sarah greeted him with a nod, "this is Special Agent Robert Kendricks, FBI Public Corruption Task Force. He's worked cases connected to Operation Clearwater before, though he never knew the operation by that name until I briefed him." Agent Kendricks extended his hand. "Mr. Blackwell, your father's work has been the missing piece in several investigations over the years. We just never knew who our unknown asset was, or what happened to the evidence he was gathering." "The evidence is safe," Thomas assured them, leading the way toward the vintage tractor where he'd hidden his father's documentation. "But we need to move quickly. Sheriff Wilcox and the Red Chain Gang have already searched the property once. They'll be back, likely with more manpower and a more thorough approach." As Thomas extracted the waterproof cases from their hiding place, Agent Kendricks examined the first set of photographs with growing interest. "This is extraordinary documentation," he murmured. "Your father was running a professional-grade surveillance operation right under their noses for years." "The Colonel was nothing if not thorough," Sarah agreed. "But what matters now is how quickly we can move to protect Thomas and secure indictments based on this evidence." Kendricks nodded grimly. "The corruption extends to the county judiciary, you said. That complicates things. We'll need to go through federal channels entirely, bypassing local authorities." "Judge Harrison signed their warrant last night," Thomas confirmed. "His name appears in my father's notes as well, connected to suspicious judicial decisions that benefited Randall's earlier land acquisitions. Then we need to move you to a secure location while we process this evidence," Kendricks decided. "Once Randall realizes we have this documentation, anyone connected to your father becomes a liability to him." Thomas shook his head firmly. "I'm not leaving my farm. That's exactly what they want, what they've been trying to force for months. If I leave now, they'll find some way to prevent me from returning." Sarah and Kendricks exchanged concerned glances. "Thomas, this isn't just about property rights anymore," Sarah argued. "These people had your father killed. They won't hesitate to do the same to you if they feel cornered." "I understand the risk," Thomas replied, his jaw set in the same determined line that had characterized Colonel Blackwell. "But I won't be driven off my land. Not by criminals hiding behind badges and respectability." Agent Kendricks studied Thomas for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Your father made a similar choice," to stand his ground despite the danger, but he didn't have the support he should have had. He reached into his jacket and removed a small device. This is a direct emergency beacon linked to our field office. Any sign of trouble, you activate it. We'll have agents here within minutes. And in the meantime, Sarah added, removing equipment from her own vehicle, we're setting up our own surveillance. If they come back, we'll have it documented by federal witnesses, not just your trail cameras. As they worked to establish a secure perimeter around the farmhouse, Thomas felt a strange sense of coming full circle. His father had turned the family farm into an intelligence-gathering outpost years ago, using its strategic position to document criminal activity. Now it was becoming a forward operating base for a federal task force using modern surveillance technology to finish what Colonel Blackwell had started. By midday, Agent Kendricks had transmitted the first batch of evidence to his superiors and received authorization for an expanded operation. "We're bringing in additional agents," he informed Thomas and Sarah. "This evidence connects to 3 open investigations across state lines. What your father documented wasn't just local corruption. It was a regional distribution network using agricultural properties as cover. That explains Randall's fixation on acquiring farms along the Eastern Corridor," Thomas realized. "It's not just about the resort development. That's just the legitimate front. He needs to control the entire transportation route." Sarah nodded. "And your farm is the linchpin, the one property with the perfect vantage point for monitoring river traffic that he's never been able to acquire." As additional federal agents arrived throughout the afternoon, establishing surveillance positions and secure communications, Thomas felt for the first time in months that he might actually prevail against the forces arrayed against him. His father had fought this battle alone for years, carrying the burden of knowledge and danger without support or recognition. Now, Thomas had the allies his father had been denied, professional investigators with the authority and resources to act on the evidence the colonel had so meticulously gathered. But he was under no illusions about the danger. Randall's organization had operated with impunity for decades, protected by corrupted officials and willing to eliminate obstacles permanently. When they realized their midnight raid had failed, to recover the evidence, and worse, that it was now in federal hands, they would respond with everything they had. The farm that had been his family's legacy for generations was about to become a battleground. The question was whether Thomas Blackwell would succeed where his father had fallen, whether justice, delayed for 20 years, could finally be delivered. As dusk approached, bringing with it the heightened possibility of another confrontation, Thomas stood on his porch with Rex at his side, looking out over fields that represented not just his livelihood, but a principled stand against corruption and intimidation. Whatever came next, he would face it on his land, continuing the fight his father had begun, not just for the Blackwell Farm, but for every person who had suffered under the shadow of Randall's criminal enterprise. The setting sun cast long shadows across the property, not unlike the shadows of corruption that had darkened Riverdale County for decades. But even the deepest shadows cannot withstand the dawn of truth, and that dawn, Thomas believed, was finally breaking. The federal response team established a secure perimeter around Blackwell Farm as darkness fell, strategically positioning agents with night vision equipment at key surveillance points. Thomas marveled at the efficiency with which they transformed his modest family property into what essentially resembled a covert tactical operation. Agent Kendricks coordinated their deployment from the farmhouse kitchen, which now resembled a command center, more than a place where Thomas had shared countless meals with his father. "We've established surveillance coverage on all approach roads," Kendricks informed Thomas and Sarah as they gathered around the kitchen table, now covered with topographical maps of the surrounding area. Any vehicle movement toward the property will trigger alerts. The perimeter team has non-lethal countermeasures if needed, but our primary objective is evidence gathering. What about aerial approaches? Sarah asked, her intelligence background evident in the question. Randall has used private helicopters in the past. Kendricks nodded. We have drone countermeasures and air jurisdiction clearance. Any unauthorized aircraft in this airspace will trigger an immediate response from the Air National Guard stationed at Wilson Field. You've thought of everything, Thomas observed, impressed by the thoroughness of the federal response, a stark contrast to the deliberate indifference he'd experienced from local authorities. Not everything, Kendricks admitted candidly. We still have a significant unknown factor, how deep the corruption extends into state agencies. Until we've completed our assessment of your father's evidence, we can't be certain which official channels might be compromised. The agent's candor was refreshing after months of gaslighting from local officials who insisted the harassment Thomas had experienced was either exaggerated or unrelated to Randall's interests. Here was someone who acknowledged the reality of the situation without minimizing the danger. The evidence needs to be our priority, Sarah emphasized. Thomas's safety is critical, but the documentation his father compiled is irreplaceable. I've arranged secure transport for the original materials, Kendricks confirmed. A helicopter will arrive at 0600 tomorrow to transfer everything to our forensic lab in the capital. In the meantime, our tech team is creating authenticated digital backups. In an adjacent room, 2 FBI technology specialists were carefully photographing, scanning, and cataloging each piece of Colonel Blackwell's evidence. The meticulous process reminded Thomas of his father's own methodical approach. The Colonel had documented everything with precision born of his military training, creating a record so thorough that it maintained its evidentiary value even decades later. What happens after the evidence is secured? Thomas asked, the question that had been weighing on him since the federal agents arrived. How long before Randall and his network face consequences? Kendricks exchanged a glance with Sarah before answering. Building a federal case against an organization this entrenched takes time. The evidence your father gathered provides an extraordinary foundation, but we'll need additional corroboration, witness testimony, and financial documentation. Meaning Randall stays free while you build your case, Thomas concluded, unable to keep the frustration from his voice. Not exactly, Sarah interjected, a hint of strategic satisfaction in her expression. The FBI works methodically, yes, but they also know how to apply pressure strategically, don't they, Agent Kendricks? The FBI agent allowed himself a small smile. We've already initiated contact with several potential witnesses identified. In the Colonel's files, individuals who were pressured or harmed by Randall's organization over the years. Some were quite eager to cooperate once they understood federal protection was available. Additionally, he continued, based on the financial records your father documented, we've filed for emergency seizure of certain assets associated with Randall developments. By tomorrow afternoon, Mr. Randall will discover that several of his accounts have been frozen pending investigation. The revelation lifted Thomas's spirits considerably. His father's work was already bearing fruit, already beginning to dismantle the criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for decades. Their strategic discussion was interrupted by an urgent alert from one of the perimeter agents. Movement detected on County Road 8. A voice reported through Kendrick's secure radio. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south, lights off, approximately 2 miles out. The FBI team shifted immediately into action, agents moving to predetermined positions with practiced efficiency. Kendricks activated a tactical display showing thermal imaging from their perimeter sensors. 6 vehicles, he identified, studying the approaching convoy. Lead vehicle matches Sheriff's Department SUV profile. Others consistent with pickup. Trucks, likely red chain transport. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore, Sarah observed grimly. No need, Thomas replied. They've operated without consequences for so long. They've become overconfident. That's what my father counted on. Arrogance making them careless. Kendricks issued rapid orders through his communication system, positioning his agents to observe and document while remaining concealed. No engagement unless directly threatened, he emphasized. We want to record their actions, not confront them yet. Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him as he watched the approaching vehicles on the thermal display. Everything had been building to this moment, not just the months of harassment he'd endured, but the years of his father's solitary vigilance, the decades of Randall's unchecked corruption. Tonight would determine whether justice would finally prevail or whether power and money would once again subvert the rule of law. They're slowing at the entrance to your access road, Kendricks narrated as they watched the thermal signatures pause at the turn leading to Blackwell Farm. Appears they're gathering before proceeding. Planning their approach, Sarah added, her expression focused as she analyzed their tactics. Standard procedure for a coordinated raid. The convoy resumed movement, turning onto Thomas's private road and proceeding more slowly toward the farmhouse. Kendricks activated an exterior camera feed, providing visual confirmation of what the thermal imaging had detected. Sheriff Wilcox's official vehicle leading a procession of pickup trucks filled with red chain members, followed by a luxury SUV that Thomas immediately recognized. That's Randall himself, he said, pointing to the last vehicle. He usually sends subordinates to do his dirty work. If he's here personally, they're planning something definitive. Or he's here to recover something specific, Sarah suggested. Something he doesn't trust others to recognize or secure. The convoy stopped approximately 200 yards from the farmhouse, arranging their vehicles in a semicircle facing the house, a tactical position that provided cover while controlling the approaches to the main structure. Sheriff Wilcox emerged first, followed by red chain members who immediately took up positions behind their vehicles, many clearly carrying weapons. Finally, James Randall stepped from his SUV, his expensive suit incongruous against the rural backdrop and tactical positioning of his allies. They're armed for serious confrontation, Kendricks observed, his voice professionally detached despite the escalating threat. I count at least 15 individuals with long guns, plus sidearms. On the others, this isn't a search party, Sarah stated the obvious. This is an elimination team. Thomas felt a chill despite the warm kitchen. They've come to kill me and destroy any remaining evidence. Exactly what they did to your father, Sarah confirmed grimly, but this time they're walking into a federal operation with full surveillance. Through the exterior cameras, they could see Sheriff Wilcox using a vehicle-mounted spotlight to illuminate the farmhouse while using his cruiser's public address system. His voice carried clearly through the night air and the farmhouse's security system. Thomas Blackwell, this is Sheriff Wilcox. We have a report of armed trespassers on your property. Come out with your hands visible so we can secure your safety. Creative pretext, Sarah muttered. Setting up the narrative for when they discover you were unfortunately killed by these alleged trespassers. Kendricks was already documenting the deception, recording the sheriff's false claims while his agents maintained their concealed positions around the property. Standard corrupt playbook, he agreed. Create a fictional scenario that justifies deadly force. The sheriff repeated his announcement, the pretense of legitimate law enforcement wearing thinner with each passing moment as the armed red chain members spread out into obvious assault positions. How do you want to play this? Kendricks asked. Thomas, respecting that it was still his property and his decision on how to respond. We can maintain our concealed position and document everything. Or we can announce federal presence and take control of the situation. Thomas considered the options carefully. His instinct was to confront these men who had harassed him, threatened him, and likely murdered his father. But confrontation carried risks not just to himself, but to the federal agents positioned around his property. More importantly, direct conflict might compromise the evidence they were working to secure. My father gathered evidence for years without confrontation, Thomas reflected. He understood that documentation was more powerful than direct conflict. Let's follow his example. Record everything. Build the case stronger. Let them show their true intentions on federal surveillance. Kendricks nodded with approval. Wise choice. We'll maintain position and... He was interrupted by a sudden development visible on their monitors. James Randall had stepped forward, taking the public address microphone from Sheriff Wilcox and addressing the farmhouse directly. Blackwell. Randall's voice carried a confidence born of decades of unchallenged power. Let's dispense with the theatrics. We know you found Williams' surveillance equipment. We know you've made contact with federal authorities. He paused, his next words carrying a chilling certainty. Just like your father did 20 years ago. We all remember how that ended. The blatant reference to Colonel Blackwell's murder, captured on federal recordings, caused an immediate reaction among the FBI team. One of the evidence technicians actually stopped her work momentarily, staring at the monitor in disbelief at such an explicit admission. Did he just... she began. Yes, Kendricks confirmed, his professional demeanor momentarily giving way to grim satisfaction. He just implicated himself in a federal homicide investigation on video with multiple witnesses. Thomas felt a complex wave of emotions, vindication that his suspicions about his father's death were confirmed, rage at the casual way Randall referenced the murder, and determination that this time justice would not be subverted. Randall continued, unaware that every word was strengthening the case against him. I'm prepared to be reasonable, unlike last time. $5 million for the farm and all materials related to Williams' hobby. You walk away wealthy and alive, which is a better deal than your father got. The assembled Red Chain members and corrupted sheriff stood by, seemingly unconcerned by Randall's explicit references to past crimes, a testament to how completely they believed themselves beyond accountability. They really think they're untouchable, Sarah murmured, shaking her head at the brazen criminality on display. 20 years of operating with impunity will create that illusion, Kendricks replied. An illusion we're about to shatter. Randall, receiving no response from the darkened farmhouse, continued with growing impatience. You have 5 minutes to respond, Blackwell. After that, we'll have to assume you're hostile and respond accordingly. He checked his expensive watch. Your time starts now. On the surveillance monitors, they could see the Red Chain members checking their weapons and adjusting their positions, preparing for what they clearly anticipated would be a violent assault on the farmhouse. Thomas looked to Kendricks. What's our plan? The FBI agent was communicating rapidly with his team through his secure earpiece. We have all we need. Conspiracy to commit murder, explicit threatening, illegal weapons, corrupt law enforcement. We're moving to intervention phase. He turned to Thomas and Sarah. I need you both to stay inside, away from windows, and follow emergency protocols if shooting starts. Kendricks pressed a button on his communications device. All units, execute Operation Daybreak. Non-lethal interdiction authorized. Full surveillance continuation mandatory. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Powerful floodlights suddenly illuminated the entire area around the convoy from multiple directions, momentarily blinding Randall and his assembled force. Simultaneously, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors filled the air as 2 FBI tactical Helicopters crested the tree line, their spotlights adding to the brilliant illumination that had transformed night into day. On their monitors, Thomas and Sarah watched as FBI agents emerged from concealed positions around the property, weapons trained on the now exposed convoy. A voice boomed from one of the helicopters. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are surrounded. Drop your weapons immediately and place your hands on your heads. This entire area is under federal jurisdiction." The reactions among Randall's group varied from shock to panic. Several Red Chain members immediately dropped their weapons, while others looked to their leadership for direction. Sheriff Wilcox stood frozen, his corrupt authority suddenly meaningless in the face of federal intervention. Only Randall himself maintained his composure, his expression shifting from surprise to calculated assessment. "Sheriff, do something," one of the Red Chain members shouted. "They can't interfere with a county law enforcement operation." Wilcox seemed uncertain, caught between his alleged authority and the overwhelming federal presence. "This is an authorized county sheriff's operation," he attempted, his voice lacking conviction. "We have jurisdiction here." "Your jurisdiction has been superseded," came the immediate response from the FBI tactical team leader, who had advanced to a position covering the convoy. "We have federal warrants for James Randall and associates regarding organized crime, corruption, and homicide investigations. All individuals present are subject to these warrants." What followed was a textbook federal intervention. As Thomas, Sarah, and Agent Kendricks watched from the farmhouse, the FBI tactical team systematically disarmed and secured each member of Randall's group. The Red Chain members, stripped of their weapons and bravado, were secured with plastic restraints and organized into a controlled group. Sheriff Wilcox, after a brief moment of considering resistance, surrendered his weapon and badge with the defeated expression of a man who knew his corrupt empire had finally collapsed. Only Randall himself attempted to maintain his dignity, straightening his expensive suit jacket as agents secured his hands behind his back. "This is harassment," he declared, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "My attorneys will have this operation shut down by morning." The FBI tactical team leader simply continued processing him professionally, reciting his Miranda rights with methodical precision. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the arrests proceeded, Agent Kendricks received updates through his communications system. "They've secured a laptop in Randall's vehicle," he informed Thomas and Sarah. "Initial examination shows files related to Colonel Blackwell and Operation Clearwater. Appears Randall has been monitoring for any sign of your father's evidence resurfacing for years." "That explains why they moved so quickly after I found the storm shelter," Thomas realized. "They've been waiting for this moment, afraid of what my father documented." "With good reason," Sarah added as they watched the systematic processing of prisoners on their monitors. "The colonel built a case that has now brought down their entire operation." By sunrise, the scene at Blackwell Farm had transformed completely. The FBI evidence transport helicopter had arrived as scheduled, securing Colonel Blackwell's irreplaceable documentation for federal analysis and protection. Randall, Sheriff Wilcox, and 23 Red Chain members had been transported to federal holding facilities, the first step in what promised to be a comprehensive prosecution of corruption that had spanned decades. As Thomas stood on his porch, watching federal agents completing their evidence collection across his property, he felt a profound sense of closure beginning to form. The land that had been his family's legacy for generations, the vantage point his father had used to document criminal activity at great personal risk, had served its purpose one final time, becoming the stage for justice delayed, but not ultimately denied. Sarah joined him, offering a cup of coffee as they watched the operation winding down. "Your father would be proud," she said simply. "He never got to see the results of his work, but he laid the foundation for everything that happened here today. He always taught me that integrity matters more than immediate results," Thomas reflected, gazing across fields that would now remain free from harassment and intimidation. "That standing your ground against wrongdoing is worthwhile even when victory isn't guaranteed." "A lesson worth remembering," Agent Kendricks added, joining them on the porch. "We've secured the final evidence and completed our documentation of the property. Preliminary assessment suggests we have sufficient evidence for federal prosecution on multiple fronts: corruption, racketeering, narcotics distribution, and several homicides, including your father's." "How long before Randall faces trial?" Thomas asked, the question that had been foremost in his mind since the arrests began. "Federal prosecutors are already preparing indictments," Kendricks replied. "With the evidence your father gathered, combined with what we documented last night, they'll move quickly. Randall's financial resources make him a flight risk, so he'll remain in custody pending trial." "And the other farmers who were harassed?" Thomas pressed. "The ones who sold their land under pressure or threats?" "That's where civil litigation will follow the criminal cases," Sarah explained. "Those sales can be challenged as coerced transactions once the criminal convictions establish the pattern of intimidation." Thomas nodded, gazing toward the eastern horizon, where the rising sun illuminated his fields with the promise of a new beginning. The previous day's uncertainty and danger had given way to vindication and the first real hope he'd felt in months. His farm, the land his family had tended for generations, was secure not just from immediate threats, but from the systemic corruption that had targeted it for decades. "What happens now?" he asked, the immediate crisis resolved, but the future still taking shape. "Now," Agent Kendrick said, "you go back to being a farmer. Your part in this operation is complete, though we'll need your testimony when the cases go to trial. And I go back to my regular caseload," Sarah added, "though I expect I'll be consulting with the FBI on connecting your father's evidence to other open investigations." Thomas considered their words, feeling both satisfaction and a strange emptiness. For months, his existence had been defined by resistance, standing against harassment, fighting to save his farm, and ultimately continuing his father's mission to expose corruption. With that fight suddenly won, he found himself contemplating a return to normalcy that somehow felt insufficient. "My father spent years gathering evidence while maintaining his cover as a simple farmer," Thomas said slowly, working through his thoughts aloud. "He understood that some battles require patience, documentation, and strategic thinking rather than direct confrontation." Sarah studied him curiously. "What are you considering, Thomas?" "Riverdale County has been under Randall's influence for decades," he replied. "With him gone, there's going to be a vacuum, one that needs to be filled by people committed to integrity and accountability." Kendricks raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking about something beyond just returning to farming." Thomas nodded, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. "The county commissioner elections are next year. Maybe it's time for someone who understands the value of oversight and transparency to step forward. Someone who's seen firsthand what happens when power operates without accountability." Sarah smiled, recognition dawning in her expression. "From defending your own farm to protecting the entire county, your father took a similar path, from individual military service to protecting his community through Operation Clearwater. The best defense against corruption is engaged citizenship," Thomas said, recalling one of his father's frequent observations. "People who are willing to stand up, speak out, and serve when necessary." As the FBI team completed their final preparations for departure, Thomas walked his property one last time with Rex faithfully at his side. The land felt different now, No longer just the family legacy he was duty-bound to protect, but a foundation from which to extend the principles of integrity and justice his father had exemplified. The German shepherd paused at the spot where they had hidden Colonel Blackwell's evidence in the vintage tractor, seeming to sense the significance of what had transpired. Thomas knelt beside his faithful companion, scratching behind his ears as he gazed across fields that would soon be ready for spring planting. "We stood our ground, boy," he said quietly, "just like the Colonel taught us. Some fights are worth having, even when the odds seem impossible." The Red Chain Gang had indeed confronted the wrong farmer, not just a man determined to protect his property, but the son of the operative who had meticulously documented their crimes, raised with the same unwavering commitment to principle that had defined his father's life. In choosing to stand his ground rather than retreat, Thomas Blackwell had not only secured justice for his father, but had demonstrated that even the most entrenched corruption cannot withstand the power of truth when backed by courage and perseverance. As he walked back toward the farmhouse, Thomas felt his father's presence more strongly than he had in years, not as a ghost of the past, but as an enduring example of how one person's determined stand for principle can ultimately topple even the most powerful systems of corruption. The seeds the Colonel had planted 2 decades ago had finally borne fruit. Justice delayed but ultimately delivered, and a legacy of integrity that would continue to shape Riverdale County for generations to come. 3 years after the dramatic confrontation at Blackwell Farm that led to the arrest of James Randall and his criminal network, the landscape of Riverdale County had transformed both literally and figuratively. What had begun as one farmer's stand against intimidation had catalyzed changes that rippled through every aspect of community life. Thomas Blackwell stood on the freshly painted porch of his farmhouse, surveying fields now thriving under sustainable farming practices he'd implemented with the security and resources that came from operating without constant harassment. Rex, graying but still alert, lay at his feet enjoying the spring sunshine as they did each morning before beginning the day's work. "Admiring your handiwork, Commissioner?" Sarah Donovan asked, joining him with 2 mugs of coffee. Their professional relationship had evolved into something deeper during the lengthy federal trials and subsequent community rebuilding efforts, culminating in marriage the previous year, a partnership that bridged the practical world of agriculture with her investigative expertise. "Just taking it all in," Thomas replied, accepting the steaming mug. "Sometimes I still expect to hear motorcycles in the distance." Sarah leaned against the porch railing, surveying the property alongside him. 3 years without a single red chain sighting. "I'd call that a successful rural renewal program." Thomas smiled at her understated description of what had been a comprehensive transformation. His successful run for county commissioner had been just the beginning. With Randall's criminal enterprise dismantled and his corrupting influence removed, Riverdale County had experienced a renaissance of civic engagement and economic development that few could have predicted. "The Eastern Farmland Corridor meeting is at 10, Sarah reminded him, checking her watch. "The agricultural sustainability proposals need your input before the final vote." The mention of the Eastern Corridor, once the target of Randall's predatory acquisition strategy, now represented one of Thomas's proudest achievements. The collaborative farming initiative he'd established had united the previously targeted farms into a cooperative that shared resources, implemented cutting-edge sustainable practices, and together had achieved economic stability that would have been impossible individually. "I've got my presentation ready," he assured her. "The federal rural development grant should push us over the finish line." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar government SUV coming up the driveway. Agent Robert Kendricks, now promoted to Assistant Director of the FBI's Public Corruption Division, stepped out looking considerably more relaxed than he had during their first meeting 3 years earlier. "Morning, Blackwells," he greeted them, joining them on the porch with the easy familiarity of someone who had shared life-changing experiences. "Thought I'd deliver this update in person, rather than through channels." Thomas offered him coffee, which Kendricks accepted gratefully. "Final update on the Randall prosecution?" "James Randall's last appeal was denied yesterday," Kendricks confirmed, satisfaction evident in his tone. 25 years without possibility of parole. The maximum sentence for the corruption and conspiracy charges. The separate homicide trial for your father's murder is scheduled for next month, but with the evidence we've secured from Randall's former associates in exchange for reduced sentences, conviction is virtually certain. The news brought a complex wave of emotions for Thomas. Closure for his father's murder, vindication of Colonel Blackwell's years of solitary vigilance, and the final dismantling of the criminal enterprise that had held Riverdale County in its grip for decades. "And Sheriff Wilcox?" Sarah asked, having maintained professional interest in all aspects of the case. 18 years, Kendricks replied. He might have received less had he cooperated earlier, but his initial attempts to obstruct justice didn't earn him any goodwill with the federal prosecutors. Thomas nodded, processing the information that represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with his discovery of his father's hidden evidence cache. What about the civil cases, the farmers who were forced to sell under duress? "That's actually the other reason for my visit," Kendrick said, his expression brightening. "The federal court approved the class action settlement yesterday. All affected property owners will receive compensation for the difference between what they were paid and fair market value, plus damages for harassment and intimidation. That will make a real difference for families who lost generational farms," Thomas observed, thinking of neighbors who had reluctantly sold under pressure from Randall's tactics. Some might even be able to repurchase their properties. "Several already have," Kendricks confirmed. "The asset forfeiture from Randall Developments has funded a community restoration trust that's facilitating repurchase for original owners at protected rates." As they continued discussing the legal resolutions that were finally bringing complete closure to Randall's decades of corruption, a school bus appeared on the county road bordering Blackwell Farm, slowing as it approached the property's educational access point. "Looks like your first tour group of the day has arrived," Sarah noted, checking her watch. "Right on schedule." The transformation of a portion of Blackwell Farm into an agricultural education center had been Thomas's most personally meaningful project. The same strategic vantage point that Colonel Blackwell had used to document criminal activity now served as an ideal location for teaching sustainable farming practices to younger generations. 35 fourth graders about to learn where their food comes from, Thomas said with anticipation rather than dread. His initial reluctance about public education initiatives had given way to genuine enthusiasm as he witnessed children's reactions to hands-on farming experiences. "I should head out," Kendrick said, finishing his coffee. "Just wanted to deliver the news personally. Your father's case was legendary within certain circles of the Bureau long before we knew his identity. Being able to finally close it properly and see his work vindicated means a lot to many of us." As Kendricks departed, Thomas and Sarah walked together toward the renovated barn that now served as the Blackwell Agricultural Education Center. The facility, funded through a combination of federal grants and community support, had become a model for rural educational initiatives across the state. "Commissioner Blackwell," called Eleanor Jenkins, the retired schoolteacher who coordinated the educational programs. "Perfect timing. The Lincoln Elementary fourth graders are particularly excited about the sustainable irrigation demonstration." Thomas greeted the children and their teachers as they disembarked from the bus, their enthusiasm palpable as they pointed at the working farm equipment and livestock visible from the arrival area. For many of these urban and suburban children, this represented their first direct exposure to agriculture beyond grocery store products. "Welcome to Blackwell Farm," Thomas began, falling into the introduction he had refined over numerous tour groups. "This land has been in my family for 4 generations, and today you're going to learn not just how we grow food, but how we can do it while protecting our soil, conserving water, and ensuring that farms like this one can feed your children and grandchildren in the future." As he led the children through interactive demonstrations of soil conservation, water management, and sustainable livestock practices, Thomas was struck by how naturally he had adapted to this educational role. The same passion for protecting his land that had fueled his resistance against Randall had transformed into a commitment to building agricultural literacy and sustainability awareness in younger generations. "Mr. Blackwell," one particularly inquisitive girl asked during the irrigation demonstration, "my grandpa says his farm went out of business because big companies made it impossible for small farmers to survive. How come your farm is still here?" The innocent question touched on the very heart of Thomas's journey. He knelt to the child's level, considering how to frame a complex reality in terms a 4th grader could understand. "Your grandpa's right, that farming has gotten much harder for small family operations," he acknowledged. "But I learned something important when our farm was threatened. I learned that farmers are stronger when we work together, share resources, and have a community that understands why local farms matter." He gestured toward the eastern fields where several neighboring farms were visible. "Now, instead of each farm trying to do everything alone, we cooperate. Some of us focus on dairy, others on vegetables or grains. We share expensive equipment instead of each buying our own, and we make sure our community understands that when they buy local food, they're not just getting fresher produce. They're helping keep farms like your grandpa's in business." "Could my grandpa's farm come back?" the girl asked, hope brightening her expression. "It might," Thomas answered honestly. "In this county, we've created special programs to help family farms restart or stay in business. Maybe your grandpa could talk to me after the tour, and I could tell him about those programs." "No." As the educational tour continued, Sarah coordinated with the teachers to ensure the curriculum connections were being reinforced, while Thomas demonstrated the innovative water conservation system he'd implemented, a system that had increased efficiency by 40% while reducing costs, making it a model being adopted across the county's agricultural properties. By midday, as the school group departed with enthusiastic waves and handmade thank you cards, Thomas found himself reflecting on how completely his life had been transformed from that moment 3 years earlier when he had discovered his father's hidden evidence cache. The desperate farmer facing harassment and intimidation had evolved into a community leader implementing systemic changes that went far beyond personal survival. "You've got that reflective look again," Sarah observed as they walked back toward the farmhouse for lunch before Thomas's county commissioner meeting. "Penny for your thoughts?" "Just thinking about how differently things might have turned out," he admitted. "If I hadn't found my father's evidence, if you hadn't responded to my email, if Kendricks hadn't believed us enough to commit federal resources. Any one of those things could have led to Randall succeeding where he failed with my father." Sarah considered his words thoughtfully. "Maybe. Or maybe your father built such a compelling case precisely because he knew someday it would be found. He created a legacy of evidence that was too powerful to ignore once it came to light. A legacy that extended beyond evidence," Thomas added. "He taught me to stand my ground, to recognize that some fights are worth having, even when victory isn't guaranteed. Without those lessons, I might have sold to Randall years ago. As they approached the farmhouse, Thomas noticed a car he didn't recognize parked near the side entrance. Were we expecting visitors? Actually, yes, Sarah replied with a slight smile. Someone I thought you should meet before your commissioner meeting. Curious, Thomas followed her into the kitchen where an elderly man sat at the table, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug. He stood as they entered, and Thomas felt an immediate sense of recognition despite never having met him before. Thomas, this is Michael Carter, Sarah introduced them. He served with your father in military intelligence before being assigned as his handler for Operation Clearwater. You're Nighthawk, Thomas realized, recalling the code name from his father's journals, the asset who had provided crucial intelligence about Randall's operation. Carter nodded, extending a hand. William saved my life in Sarajevo before we ever started Clearwater. When he recruited me as his inside source on Randall's operation, I didn't hesitate. His expression clouded. What happened to him has weighed on me for 20 years. I tried to get the Bureau to investigate his death as suspicious, but without his final evidence cache. You couldn't prove what you suspected, Thomas finished, understanding the frustration all too well. Agent Kendricks thought it was time we met, Carter explained. With the final prosecutions approaching completion and your father's role about to become part of the public record, he thought you might want to hear about William from someone who worked alongside him. For the next hour, over a lunch, Sarah had thoughtfully prepared in anticipation of this meeting. Carter shared stories about Colonel Blackwell that Thomas had never heard. Tales of his father's intelligence work, his unwavering ethical standards in environments where such principles were rare, and most valuably, insights into the man behind the military discipline. Your father could have advanced much higher in military intelligence, Carter revealed. He was offered command positions multiple times, but he always maintained that his real purpose was here, protecting his community, preserving this land for you. He never told me about any of that, Thomas said, absorbing this new dimension of his father's life. William was pathologically modest, Carter chuckled. But make no mistake, what he accomplished with Operation Clearwater was extraordinary, single-handedly documenting a criminal enterprise over years, while maintaining his cover as a farmer, creating fail-safes to ensure the evidence would eventually emerge, even if he couldn't deliver it himself. It was masterful intelligence work. Fail-safes? Thomas questioned, curious about this detail. Carter nodded. The contingency package you found wasn't the only one. William created multiple potential pathways for his evidence to come to light. The map in your father's contingency package, it wasn't random that you found it when you did. What do you mean? Thomas asked, leaning forward. The folder was designed with a time-release archival adhesive, Carter explained. After 20 years, it would naturally separate from its hiding place during temperature fluctuations, making it likely to be discovered during routine attic activities. Your father designed it that way. Even if he couldn't expose Randall directly, he ensured the evidence would emerge when you were old enough to understand its significance. The revelation struck Thomas deeply. The idea that his discovery of his father's evidence hadn't been mere coincidence, but part of Colonel Blackwell's final contingency plan. Even in death, the colonel had been working to protect both his son and his community, orchestrating justice with patience that spanned decades. As Carter prepared to leave, he handed Thomas a small wooden box. Your father wanted you to have this if the operation was ever declassified. Since the federal case is now concluding and Randall's prosecution is public record, I've been authorized to deliver it. Inside the box, Thomas found his father's Distinguished Intelligence Medal, an award he hadn't known his father had received, along with a handwritten letter dated just 1 week before the colonel's death. "I'll leave you to read that privately," Carter said, standing to depart. "But I want you to know something, Thomas. William would be extraordinarily proud of what you've accomplished, not just in bringing Randall to justice, but in how you've revitalized this community afterward. You've extended his legacy in ways even he might not have imagined." After Carter's departure, Thomas sat on the porch with Sarah beside him, his father's letter in hand. The familiar handwriting brought an immediate connection to the man whose shadow had guided Thomas through the darkest days of confronting Randall's criminal enterprise. "Do you want privacy?" Sarah asked gently. Thomas shook his head. "No, whatever he wrote, I want to share it with you." The letter was characteristically concise. The colonel had never been one for flowery sentiment, but its contents resonated with meaning that bridged the decades since it was written. "Thomas, if you're reading this, then Operation Clearwater has finally concluded, though likely not as I originally planned. The evidence I've gathered over the past 13 years documents corruption that has damaged our community at every level, with tentacles reaching into law enforcement, local government, and the judiciary. I pursued this investigation not just from duty to country, but from love for this land that has been in our family for generations, and for you and the community you will inherit. Some battles must be fought even when victory is uncertain, because fighting itself makes a statement that injustice will not go unchallenged. Know that whatever happened to me, I considered the risk worthwhile. The farm is more than soil and crops. It is a vantage point, literally and figuratively, from which to stand against corruption. Use it wisely. Whatever course you choose after Clearwater concludes, remember that true strength lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Integrity is maintaining your principles, even when doing so comes at personal cost." With pride and love, Dad Thomas carefully refolded the letter, emotions too complex for words washing through him. The father he had known, practical, sometimes distant, unwavering in his principles, was fully present in these words. But so too was a depth of purpose and foresight Thomas had only glimpsed during his childhood. "He knew," Thomas said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion. "He knew the risks he was taking might cost him his life, but he continued because he believed the fight itself mattered, regardless of outcome." "Like father, like son," Sarah observed softly, her hand finding his. "You made the same choice when you stood against Randall instead of taking his buyout offer." Thomas nodded, recognition dawning. "I always thought I was just being stubborn, refusing to be driven off land that had been in my family for generations. But it was more than that. It was continuing my father's stand against corruption, even before I knew what he'd been fighting." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across fields that had witnessed both struggle and renewal, Thomas carefully placed his father's letter in the wooden box alongside the medal. This tangible connection to Colonel Blackwell would take a place of honor in the farmhouse that had been the center of both their lives, a reminder of the principles that had guided them through their darkest challenges. With Sarah beside him, Thomas prepared for his county commissioner meeting where the Eastern Farmland Corridor Initiative would take another step forward. The work of rural renewal that had begun with his stand against Randall's intimidation had evolved into a community-wide commitment to agricultural sustainability, economic resilience, and transparent governance. The Red Chain Gang had indeed confronted the wrong farmer, not just a man determined to protect his land, but the heir to a legacy of principled resistance against corruption that had ultimately transformed an entire community. In standing his ground, Thomas Blackwell had not only honored his father's memory, but had extended that legacy into a future where farms like his could thrive for generations to come. As he drove toward the county offices, passing farms now operating without fear of harassment or intimidation, Thomas reflected on the simple truth his father had understood decades earlier: that some battles must be fought regardless of assured outcome, that integrity is measured not by victories, but by the willingness to stand firm when principles are challenged, and that true heroism often lies not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, persistent defense of what is right, even when that defense spans generations. The pack of bikers who had roared onto his property that fateful night had expected to find a vulnerable target, isolated and defenseless against their intimidation. Instead, they had encountered the living embodiment of Colonel William Blackwell's legacy, a farmer who understood that some ground is worth defending at any cost, that corruption thrives only when good people remain silent, and that even the most entrenched criminal enterprises cannot withstand the power of truth when backed by unwavering courage. 10 years after Thomas Blackwell's stand against the Red Chain Gang that had terrorized Riverdale County, the transformation that had begun with one farmer's refusal to be intimidated had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined. What had started as a desperate defense of his family's land had catalyzed a regional agricultural renaissance that was now being studied and replicated across rural communities nationwide. On a brilliant autumn morning, Thomas stood at the podium, erected on the grounds of what was now officially the Blackwell Center for Agricultural Innovation, addressing the gathered crowd of farmers, educators, government officials, and media, representatives who had come to witness the dedication of the expanded facility. A decade ago, this farm was nearly lost, Thomas began, gesturing to the surrounding fields, now serving as both working agricultural land and living classrooms. Not just to foreclosure or financial pressures, but to a criminal enterprise that saw rural communities as resources to be exploited rather than legacies to be preserved. The audience, familiar with the now famous story of Thomas's confrontation with the Red Chain Gang and the subsequent exposure of James Randall's decades of corruption, nodded in solemn recognition. My father, Colonel William Blackwell, understood something fundamental about defending what matters, Thomas continued. He knew that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with unwavering principle, meticulous documentation, and the patience to allow justice to unfold in its own time. Sarah sat in the front row, their 9-year-old daughter Willow beside her, the child's rapt attention fixed on her father as he spoke. Though born years after the dramatic events that had transformed Riverdale County, Willow had been raised on stories of her grandfather's courage and her father's determination. Stories that had shaped her precocious interest in both agriculture and justice. Today, as we dedicate this expanded center, we're not just celebrating a building or a program, Thomas continued. We're celebrating the resilience of rural communities, the power of sustainable agriculture to revitalize economies, and most importantly, the impact of citizens standing firmly against corruption, even when the cost of that stand seems impossibly high. The expanded center represented the culmination of Thomas's vision for agricultural renewal, a 15,000-square-foot facility housing research laboratories, educational classrooms, and collaborative spaces where farmers, scientists, and policy makers could work together to address the challenges facing rural communities. Funded through a combination of federal grants, private donations, and revenues from the innovative farming practices developed on Blackwell land, the center had become a beacon of rural possibility. In the decades since Thomas had discovered his father's evidence cache, Riverdale County had transformed from a community plagued by corruption and economic decline into a nationally recognized model for agricultural innovation and transparent governance. The farmland that had once been targeted for Randall's fraudulent resort development now comprised the Eastern Agricultural Cooperative, 15 family farms working together to implement sustainable practices while achieving economic viability that would have been impossible individually. As Thomas concluded his address and the ceremonial ribbon was cut, opening the new center officially, Agent Kendricks, now Director Kendricks of the FBI's Rural Crimes Division, approached with a warmth that reflected their years of friendship following the initial investigation. "Quite a legacy you've built here," Kendricks observed, surveying the facility and the thriving agricultural operations surrounding it. "From defending one farm to revolutionizing rural development policies nationwide. Not what either of us expected when we first met." Thomas smiled, acknowledging the journey's unexpected turns. "My father always said that standing your ground was important, not just for what it protects in the moment, but for the precedent it sets for the future. I'm not sure even he could have envisioned how that principle would expand." The most remarkable aspect of Riverdale County's transformation wasn't just the economic revival or the innovative agricultural practices. It was the fundamental shift in community engagement and governance. The corruption that had infected every level of county leadership had been replaced by transparent processes, citizen oversight committees, and a culture of accountability that had made the region a case study in rural democratic renewal. As the dedication ceremony transitioned to community tours of the new facility, Thomas found a quiet moment with Sarah and Willow, watching with satisfaction as visitors explored the center that represented both a personal and community triumph. "Dad," Willow asked, her expression thoughtful beyond her years, "Grandpa's picture is everywhere in the new building, but you told me he never got to see any of this. Do you think he would have liked it?" Thomas knelt to his daughter's level, struck by the insight behind her question. "Your grandfather was a practical man," he explained. "He valued results over recognition. What would matter to him isn't that his picture is on the wall, but that the work he began continues, that this community is thriving because someone was willing to stand up when standing up was difficult." "Yeah, like you did with the bikers," Willow nodded, connecting the stories she'd grown up hearing. "Like many people have done since," Thomas corrected gently. "The real change here didn't come from one person's stand, but from an entire community, deciding that integrity matters, that sustainable practices matter, that building something lasting matters more than quick profits." As they walked together through the center named for their family but dedicated to community benefit, Thomas reflected on how completely the legacy of confrontation had transformed into one of collaboration. The same strategic vantage point that Colonel Blackwell had used to document criminal activity, that Thomas had defended against intimidation, now served as a gathering place where farmers shared knowledge, researchers developed innovations, and children learned the value of both agricultural heritage and ethical leadership. The pack of bikers had indeed confronted the wrong farmer, not just because Thomas had found the courage to stand against their intimidation, not just because his father's evidence had ultimately brought down their criminal network, but because that confrontation had sparked a renewal that extended far beyond one family's farm to transform an entire region's understanding of what rural communities could achieve when corruption was replaced by collaboration. As Thomas watched his daughter expertly explaining the center's sustainable irrigation system to a group of visiting agricultural students, her knowledge reflecting both the Blackwell farming heritage and the scientific innovation the center championed, he recognized the true measure of victory against those who had sought to intimidate him a decade earlier. They had wanted to silence one farmer. Instead, they had inadvertently helped create a movement that had given voice to an entire rural community's potential for renewal and resilience. The defense of Blackwell Farm had never really been about one piece of land or one family's legacy. It had been about the principle Colonel William Blackwell had understood decades earlier and had passed to his son through both words and example. that corruption thrives only when good people remain silent, that integrity requires standing firm, even when the cost is high, and that the most important battles are often fought not for immediate victory, but for the legacy they create for generations yet to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.